Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. In this video, I'll be ranking the world that each Final Fantasy game takes place in. Final Fantasy games are known for their expansive, interesting worlds that players fall in love with over the course of their massive journeys. For my ranking, I'm going to consider a number of factors, like how interesting the geography and culture of the world is, and how consistent is the internal logic in each world. Do they feel like real places, or just a bunch of random stuff slapped together? How well was the world crafted? Is there something unique and interesting about the world? I'll be factoring in all of those considerations and more as I go into my ranking. This is one of the few categories where I will factor in MMO expansion content and not just the content in the base game. Now that we've gotten the housekeeping out of the way, let's get on to the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy I. Out of all the games in the series, Final Fantasy I's world feels the most generic. Being that it was the first game in the series, there wasn't as much iconography to draw from. Thus, the world of Final Fantasy I in some way feels less like a Final Fantasy world and more just a standard fantasy world. While there are a couple sci-fi elements thrown in for good measure, their presence is rather minimal. Final Fantasy I's world doesn't feel like a living, breathing fantasy world, it feels like an average, generic, video game fantasy world. It easily takes last place on this list. Number 15, Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II's world feels much more cohesive than I's. Though the world map has an odd design, the interactions and transitions between the different regions feels more sensible, both from a geographical and geopolitical perspective. It feels far more realistic and less haphazard and random, but it does ultimately feel very small, though that's likely due to the limitations of the hardware of when the game was first conceived. The size of the world is the biggest knock against it. The world of Final Fantasy II feels more like a small country than an entire planet, but that small country is extremely well defined with a distinct vibe, internal logic, and narrative consistency. Number 14, Final Fantasy III. The world of Final Fantasy III has a much larger scope than the first two games. The actual lore and backstory behind 3's world is more interesting than 1's and more fun than 2's. The floating continent, where the early hours of the game takes place, feels as big as the entirety of the worlds in the first two games. And when you finally leave the floating continent and realize it's just a small part of a much larger world, it's pretty mind-blowing. 3 has a great sense of scope with its interesting locales to visit, both on land and under the ocean floor. 2's world feels real, but doesn't feel like a fun place to visit. 3's world still has a lot of issues for the peaceful tourist, but feels like it'd be more fun to explore than 2's dark hellscape. The world of Final Fantasy III feels like a real, living, breathing world with rich history. Its grand scope easily places it above the first two entries in the series, at least in regards to the world it built. Number 13, Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII's world has a ton of hidden lore behind it that isn't really revealed directly in the game. Hein being the most important religious figure in the history of that world is something that is completely hidden in the background text of the game, and really easy to miss when playing through the story. And even when you uncover this information, it has literally zero impact on the plot whatsoever. The world also seems to make no sense politically. Let's think about this for a second. Guardians are basically independent mercenary academies acting outside of the purview of the world's governments. They were established only a few decades prior, but they were able to establish themselves all over the globe, convince sovereign nations of their legitimacy, convince parents it's a good idea to send their children to these mercenary academies, and also are able to not receive declarations of war from countries who they meddle in the affairs of. Geopolitically, it's incoherent nonsense. And that's not even going into the relations between Ishtar, Dalit, and Galbadia. The world is full of fun places to explore. Every city has their own unique charm. Ultimisia's castle is easily the coolest final dungeon in the series. But, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the world has hidden stories buried underneath the surface. What's going on with Katdawar Isle? What's the deal with the Central Ruins? And the Undersea Research Facility? There's so many things in 8's world that have little to no explanation and are just kinda there. Don't get me wrong, these things are awesome, but the lack of lore explanation and absurdity of the politics makes the world feel like an incoherent mess. An awesome incoherent mess, but still an incoherent mess. It ranks above the NES Trilogy's worlds, because while the worlds might have more consistency, they can't compete with how interesting and cool the locations in 8 are. Number 12, Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V's world is far less interesting than the world of Final Fantasy VIII, but it is far more logically coherent and consistent. Final Fantasy V takes place on a planet known as Planet R. Planet R was split in half into two parallel worlds in different dimensions in order to seal away a dangerous power that threatened all of existence. But eventually, the worlds unite back into one as the forces of darkness gather. You begin by exploring one half of Planet R in one dimension, then the other, and then the unified world. There's a level of internal logic and consistency in the construction of V's world that VIII simply doesn't have, and it's far larger than the worlds in the NES trilogy. All of the pieces seem to fit perfectly, with nothing feeling out of place, so I can't argue with the construction of this world. While I personally enjoy the world of VIII more, I have to concede that V's feels far more believable. Number 11, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV takes place in a world known as Eos. It's an incredibly stunning and beautiful open world full of amazing scenery and interesting locations to explore. However, because the game is open world, that means that the scale of everything is much larger than the abstractions of the previous entries, meaning the size and scope of the world ends up feeling more like that of a small country than of an entire planet, similar to Final Fantasy II. The lore of the world is very interesting and very well realized, but again, the grander world feels really tiny despite offering the player so much room to explore. The world only has like 4 countries, and despite the Empire's fierce rule and almost total global domination, people are still just hanging out in diners in the desert like nothing's going on. The geopolitics made sense for the most part, and how all of the different factions relate to each other, but the size of the world makes it feel a bit more awkward. In the end, Final Fantasy XV's world is super fun to explore and feels large in terms of the game itself, but feels small in terms of planetary scope. Number 10, Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI has a very well-realized world. There's a good balance between the differing political factions and plenty of interesting places to visit. The unique steampunk vibe helps give VI's world a distinct identity from other games in the series. VI's world feels lived in and alive, with most of it making sense, though I do have some questions regarding the Phantom Train. Another strong suit of this world is something I don't enjoy much from a gameplay perspective, but respect a lot from a narrative perspective, and that is the world of Ruin. Like 5 and 15, you get to experience the world after a cataclysmic event, but while 5's world was more of a merging of worlds, and 15 barely lets you explore its world after said cataclysm, 6 allows you to fully explore the world after its apocalypse. Seeing how the terrain, people, and politics change after the midway point in the game adds a lot to the believability of 6's world, and truly makes it feel like a real place. No real complaints with this one. Number 9, Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX's Gaia is one of the most endearing worlds in the series. The Mist continent in Final Fantasy IX might be the best single continent in a Final Fantasy game. The geography is incredibly well balanced and logical. The politics, history, and culture are all extremely well defined, full of character, color, vibrancy, and life. Each major city, small town, dungeon, forest, swamp, and cavern feels like it belongs. The world feels truly alive and real. The outer continent also feels believable and is pretty great as well. However, the rest of Final Fantasy IX's world feels awkwardly empty for how massive in scale it is. The other continents feel more like unfinished parts of game design than part of the same living, breathing world as the Mist and outer continents. There's a cool parallel world that the characters go to and visit called Terra that is really fascinating, but also feels a little out of place with what came before in the game if I'm being completely honest. It does all tie together eventually, but it's not quite as cohesive as I'd like. So why does it rank above the tight construction of 6's world? Well, the reason for that is because each individual location in 9 is stronger than each individual location in 6. 6's world is more coherent and makes more sense, but no town in 6 feels as alive as Alexandria, Lindblum, Trino, or Clara. No forest feels as real as the Evil Forest. No town has as much charm and darkness under the surface as Dali. It might falter slightly as a coherent world, but the quality of each individual location is enough to elevate it to the number 9 spot on this list. Number 8, Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV knocked it out of the park with the creation of its world. The balance of geography makes for sensible geopolitics. The different kingdoms all feel culturally distinct, but yet feel like they belong in the same world. Mysidia, Fable, Troya, Baron, and Evelyn all feel very distinct from one another, and the relations they have with one another feels logically coherent. I also love the addition of the Underworld and the Moon in 4's world. While the Underworld immediately felt right to me the first time I played through the game, I'll admit that the stuff on the Moon felt a little bit out of place and awkward, similar to Terra in Final Fantasy IX. Upon reflection, however, The seeds of foreshadowing were there in 4, and the moon's importance in terms of the overall lore and history of 4's world actually is far less out of left field than I initially thought. 4's world is full of life and vibrancy across its 3 world maps. It's not too big that's overwhelming, it doesn't have any spots that feel empty, and it's not too small where the world feels like it doesn't make sense. No, 4's world is just right, and an example of an extremely well-crafted JRPG world. This next part is a bit of a spoiler, so skip ahead to the next section if you don't want to hear it. In Final Fantasy IV The After Years, it is heavily implied that the first 6 mainline Final Fantasy games are all in the same universe, and that the world of Final Fantasy IV is our planet Earth far in the past, before terraforming completely changed the planet into what we know today. At the end of the 13 trilogy, the world of Fabula Nova Crystallis transforms into our cosmos, and our planet Earth is created. So that connects the first 6 games and Fabula Nova Crystallis into one universe. It's a really fun little theory, and might be worth doing a video on someday. If I don't go for it, one of you people watching this video should take the idea and run with it. I've heard it discussed on some podcasts, but there's not a proper video essay on this, so have at it. Okay, spoilers done. Number 7, Final Fantasy XII. Number 6, Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy XII and Tactics get lumped together in this ranking because they both exist in the world of Ivalice, supposedly. I honestly consider them to be 2 different worlds given how vastly different they are from one another. There's no shared locations between the 2 games as far as I know, and Tactics supposedly takes place far in the future after 12, after all the Moogles have died out, and technology of 12's era has been lost to time. Between the 2 games there's very little similarity in terms of culture, politics, fashion, technology, locales, geography, religion, etc. I do understand and get the concept behind a lost civilization and their ancient technology, so logically it makes sense that the cultures would be vastly different, but some shared locations would really help make Ivalice feel like it's an actual world, and not just a general concept. I'm sure there are some shared locations between the 2 games, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But yeah, Tactics and 12 take place in the same world. Sure, let's go with that. In my mind, there are 2 Ivalices. There's the Ivalice of 12, Tactics Advance, Revenant Wings, and Tactics A2. The culture, technology, fashion, location, and such are consistent across these entries, which take place in the same era. There are implications that the Ivalice of Tactics Advance in A2 is a dream version of Ivalice and not the real Ivalice, and since Mont Blanc the Moogle is in the dream Ivalice from Tactics Advance and is in Final Fantasy XII, then perhaps that means that the Ivalice of Final Fantasy XII is actually a dream and fake Ivalice, and that would mean the Ivalice of Final Fantasy Tactics is the real Ivalice. Maybe. I don't know. Luso from A2 and Balthier from 12 got added to the War of the Lions port of Final Fantasy Tactics, so would that make Final Fantasy Tactics Dream Ivalice 2? Or maybe the original version of Final Fantasy Tactics is the real Ivalice, and then the War of the Lions port is actually part of Dream Ivalice. Dun dun dun! There's also figuring out how Vagrant's story fits into this world. I haven't played enough of it to judge, but it seems like it might fit in more with the Ivalice of OG Tactics. But again, I really would just like a map of Ivalice to see where everything is in relation to each other. Where is the Orban Monastery in relation to Rabanastre? While Ivalice falls apart when you're looking at all of the games as a whole, I must admit that the Ivalice contained within each individual game is very coherent and well defined. The Ivalice of 12 and the handheld titles is full of bouncy, energetic charm, and the Ivalice of Tactics is a dark and brutal world full of incredibly realistic political intrigue. Both of them are well-realized worlds and deserving of high spots on this list, but because they're technically the same world, they'll just occupy spots 7 and 6 together. You can rank whichever one you like more higher. Also, please let me know in the comments if I'm the only person who notices the weirdness of Ivalice's world or if I'm just taking crazy pills. Number 5, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII's world is stunningly gorgeous and full of great, iconic locations. The culture, lore, and history between Pulse and Cocoon feels very well defined. XIII's lore ties into the world incredibly well, and there is a logical consistency and a set of rules for the world that makes it feel very believable and real. Of course, it's really easy to organize a coherent world when it's all just a straight line. Ba-dum-dum. Okay, joking aside, XIII's world is really well written. Even small things like how the culture can become fascist-minded, the acceptance of militias, the relation between the military and religious institutions, and even how food production works in this world is all explained. And not just in the data logs either. It's a really rich and fully realized world that's actually quite excellent. However, the logical coherency of the world goes out the window in the sequels, where it begins to become an abstract myth more than a world that feels like it has its own internal rules. It can't rank any higher because of that insanity, but I do think that the world of 13 excels in a number of ways that it isn't given enough credit for. Number 4, Final Fantasy XI. First off, let me begin by saying that Vana'diel sounds like the most made-up name for a fantasy world ever. It doesn't sound like a real place, but rather something that a fantasy writer made up. That said, man, is this world incredibly believable. This is one of the categories where the advantages of being an MMO comes out in full force. 11's world is not only consistently expanding, it's also remained consistently coherent for 20 years, which is an incredibly impressive feat. Despite all of the new locations added since the game began, all of it seems to be logically consistent with the world's lore, politics, and culture, adding to the experience rather than detracting from it. Everything keeps building on top of each other in great ways, and nothing feels out of place and weird. The geography in relation to other nations across the seas all makes sense with actual boat and airship travel between locations to make them feel that much more real and connected. 11 has so much world to explore, and so much of it is really great. It has a couple of the coolest locations in any Final Fantasy game, and it's a shame most players will never experience those zones because they skip the game. In particular, there are 2 zones from the Chains of Promathia expansion that I feel are top-tier Final Fantasy locations in terms of design, story relevance, atmosphere, uniqueness, the whole shebang. Vana'diel is a very underrated world in the Final Fantasy series. It's truly incredible. Number 3, Final Fantasy XIV. Alright, so basically everything I said about Vana'diel applies to Eorzea. I will admit to not having played anything past A Realm Reborn, but I've read about locations in the other expansions, and like 11, the additions to 14's world only adds to the immersive feel of the world. Nothing feels out of place or awkward, and everything in 14's world builds on top of each other to create a realm that feels truly alive. The culture, politics, and geography all feels like a very real world, and the lore is incredibly enriching. The fact that the devs were able to tie in the destruction of 1.0 into the world building of the game is an incredible stroke of genius. I have 14 pretty low in a number of categories on this list, so I wanted to throw it a bone because I don't feel it's bad at all, and this is a category where the game truly does impress me. It's possible that I might rank it lower than 11 after consuming all the expansions, but even with just reading about Ulmor and Doma, I still expect to rank 14 really high. And the locations I've experienced feel like they're full of vibrancy and life. I feel the ruthless capitalism of Ulda's culture as much as I feel the more ethereal Gridania. It's such a well-crafted world, and the fact that the devs were able to salvage the dumpster fire of 1.0 is a testament to top-tier worldcraft. They made the impossible work, and that's truly incredible. It's certainly worthy of the number 3 spot. Number 2, Final Fantasy VII. The world of Final Fantasy VII is deceptively brilliant. Midgar is probably the single best realized location in the entire Final Fantasy series. So much so that when you first play Final Fantasy VII, it feels like the entire game could just be Midgar. I'm going to avoid the obvious commentary about the remake and move past that point to instead focus on what a massive moment the game offers when you finally leave Midgar to see it's just one small part of a much larger world, akin to the floating continents revealed in Final Fantasy III. Midgar is bleak, dirty, and dingy. The world outside is bright and vibrant. Nature hasn't succumbed to ruthless industrialization, and the environment is able to fight back against Shinra's destructive actions. But the lingering presence of the company can be felt across the globe through culture and architecture. The presence of Shinra in the greater world is a stroke of genius, as it allows for both a rich and diverse world in terms of biomes, but also ties together the locales of the planet narratively to make everything truly feel connected. Given that the theme of the game is the connection of all living things, the fact that the world's disparate cultures are connected only enhances the believability of the world. It's not a single empire controlling the planet, but the soft power of a corporation with power greater than any government. It's believable because it's only a step away from the world we live in currently. Still, it's not all just logical lore that makes the world of Final Fantasy VII great. The individual locations are full of charm and personality and are endlessly interesting. Nibelheim, the Northern Crater, Cosmo Canyon, Wutai, and so many other locations are iconic, and some of the best in the entire series. Costa del Sol and the Gold Saucer were so good that 14 decided it needed to be in that game as well. 7's world feels very real and believable, but it is also endlessly interesting. It's my personal favorite Final Fantasy world, but I don't think it's the best in the series. No, that would be number 1, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is easily, by far, the best constructed world in the Final Fantasy series, and it's not even close. It has unique culture, clothing, politics, and religion that are all tailor-made for this world, and all of it ties together perfectly. There isn't a single thing that feels out of place. Spira's cycle of death and the societal stagnation that would cause, because of the region's constant state of crisis, is an incredibly realistic trait of cultural development, as regions with more continual hardship tend to progress their value systems and customs at a much slower rate historically. That same concept explains the extended medieval-era technology in the world of Game of Thrones, with the threat of dragons from the Targaryen dynasty threatening any societal and scientific advances. Sin's constant cycle of rebirth, like the dragons in the Song of Ice and Fire universe, leads to the stagnation of Spira's conservative society. Everything about the world of 10 feels fully realized, from the dogma of the religion to the demonization of other races for political purposes. Blitzball also fits into the lore of the world incredibly well on multiple levels. I could just list off every single thing in this game and explain how it works so well, but I would be here for hours. I recommend just listening to the Resonant Arc podcast series on Final Fantasy X for more details. But beyond just the societal structure, the game is full of beautiful locations. I mean, how gorgeous is Besaid and Luca? Come on! But again, it's not just beautiful. The geography is sensible and realistic, further adding to how real Spira truly feels. Even 10-2 makes sense when it comes to the world they built in Final Fantasy X, because we all know that as soon as an entire populace decided all it wants to give up on organized religion, they would be partying like crazy. When it comes to world building, there's a clear king of the mountain in the Final Fantasy games, and Final Fantasy X easily takes the crown. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!